Are we in the thick of a new climate war, as climate scientist Michael Mann suggests in his new book, or are we in a place where science and politics are getting too closely mixed together? Maybe even both. Well, let's have a look. Michael Mann is a climatologist, a geophysicist and a political activist at the Pennsylvania State University. High profile within the climate change movement to the extent of being an icon for some and a hate figure for others, while he's been no shrinking violet when it comes to entering the fray. Whether he's shaped by his environment or his combativeness has always been part of his style, he is nevertheless unambiguously in the trenches. He's released his latest book, The New Climate War, where he argues that the forces of climate denial, his words not mine, are adopting new tactics and approaches as the reality of climate change becomes more and more established in the mainstream. In doing so, he raises questions about the role of science, the gaps between science and activism, and what the rules should be about how we conduct crucially key public policy debates on scientific questions. For the purposes of this video, whether you love him or loathe him is irrelevant. On this channel, I aim to evaluate arguments on their merits, regardless of what you do or don't think about the people making those arguments. We live in polarised times. In such times, you end up with echo chambers because people on each side create myths about the leaders on the other side to automatically disqualify their voice as having any valid contribution to make. Well, look, there are many channels you can go to for content in that mindset. The issues here are fascinating and important because they're right in this grey zone where working out what's right and what isn't is not easy. It's kind of what makes them interesting. So now we've got that established. In an ideal world, scientists worry about the science. They produce reports showing what the evidence says, and then policymakers and others take that evidence as the starting point in working out what society should do about it. And, the individual scientists may have an opinion on that latter part, because they're citizens as well as scientists. But their opinions as citizens carry no more and no less weight than anybody else's. Well, we're not in that ideal world. I think we can all agree on that. From Michael Mann's perspective, and this is clear from the beginning of his book, climate scientists are in the trenches and they've been forced there by the armies of the active science denialists. There's no question that in his view, this isn't a common problem and we need to come together and find a common solution. No. It's us versus them. And the success will come from us, the forces of goodness, defeating them, the selfish, short-term, greedy forces of denial and delay. This is what made Mann into an activist scientist. He explained his position back in 2014 for a piece in the New York Times. In my view, it is no longer acceptable for scientists to remain on the sidelines. I should know. I had no choice but to enter the fray. I was hounded by elected officials, threatened with violence and more after a single study I co-wrote a decade and a half ago found that the Northern Hemisphere's average warmth had no precedent in at least the past 1,000 years. Our hockey stick graph became a vivid centerpiece of the climate wars, and to this day it continues to win me the enmity of those who have conflated a problem of science and society with partisan politics. The article was a response to the fact that fellow scientist Jim Hansen had been involved with an illegal protest, I think. He went on to say this: "Are Dr. Hansen and his colleagues going too far? Should we resist commenting on the implications of our science? There was a time when I would, without hesitation, have answered yes to this question. In 2003, when asked in a Senate hearing to comment on a matter of policy, I readily responded that I am not a specialist in public policy and it would not be useful for me to testify on that." That's not where we are today. This is how he frames his book early on. We are in a war. But before we engage, we must first understand the mind of the enemy. What evolving tactics are the forces of denial and delay employing today in their efforts to stymie climate action? Who are the enemy? They are the fossil fuel companies, right-wing plutocrats and oil-funded governments that continue to profit from our dependence on fossil fuels. And representatives of those groups did go after him in a very direct and aggressive way, so it's not a surprise that their position has been solidified in his mind. There's a history that is validly to be criticised, where corporate actors did what vested interests often do when a problem arises that threatens their business model. They pretend there's no problem and they attack anyone who says otherwise. And there's no doubt that fossil fuel groups such as the Koch brothers set up front groups, funded other third parties to represent their arguments. And there's nothing wrong per se with getting your arguments out there. But if you use deliberate misinformation to create doubt where none exists in order to defeat legislation, most would agree that in principle that crosses a line, even if they might argue whether it does or doesn't apply to a specific argument or incident that is in front of them at the time. Mann points to how the tobacco industry attacked the science linking tobacco to cancer, how pesticide manufacturers attacked Rachel Carson over her book Silent Spring, and indeed how the coal companies went after the scientists such as Gene Likens talking about acid rain, as I covered in my recent video on that topic. He quotes Bill Brune, who'd worked on the ozone hole. Manufacturers, users and their government representatives initiated public relations campaigns designed not to illuminate but to obscure, to throw doubt on the hypothesis and the weight of scientific evidence, and to otherwise convince lawmakers and the public that the data were too uncertain to act upon. And that is totally fair enough. But where do you draw the line between the genuine misinformation, bad faith campaigns and actually good faith arguments that you just happen to disagree with? And that's one of the challenges here, because Michael is a fairly black and white kind of guy in many of those areas. One of the big weapons, says Michael Mann, of the agents of inaction is deflection. And deflection, he says, has been used by bad corporate actors in recent decades to nefarious intent. One example, he suggests, is a textbook example of deflection is the guns lobby in the United States using the slogan, "Guns don't kill people, people kill people." He said it diverts attention away from the problem of easy access to assault weapons and toward other purported contributors to mass shootings, such as mental illness or media depictions of violence. Now that seems to me not to be in the same category. I mean, I'm a Brit. I think Americans are slightly bizarre for wanting to have guns all over the place. But, you know, it's a big part of the culture and I'm not about to be all Piers Morgan about it. But surely that slogan is the alternative side putting its argument. That is not the same as deflection. And that's where you start to worry about where this line is between vested interests using modern techniques to create doubt about things that are solidly known and using the same language simply to dismiss opposing political arguments. In the same way, he quotes the tobacco industry supporting legislation to require flame retardants to be used in furniture rather than for them to have to create fire-safe cigarettes. If you suggest it's self-evident that one of those solutions is the only one that any reasonable person could consider the best result, then you're engaging in political arrogance. On the other hand, if you're pointing at the fact that a front group, Citizens for Fire Safety, was set up, and that Dr. David Heimbach, who fronted it, used to tell the heartrending stories of children who died from burns from furniture fires, and those stories were 100% made up, there you have a valid criticism of the tactics, dirty tactics, people lying in the name of their cause. It's worth criticising. But it's something I would suggest has been done in the name of all sorts of causes, including those that Michael Mann supports. Mann's most passionately felt example of deflection is the Crying Indian ad, a commercial from the early 1970s that called on people not to litter. It was considered one of the most effective ads of its time, but Mann declares it was a massive deflection campaign because it was engineered by the beverage industry, he says, to point the finger at us rather than corporations, emphasising individual responsibility over collective action and government regulation. As far as Mann's concerned, it should have been so self-evident in the 1970s that the answer to litter by citizens was to get the companies who manufactured the things they were discarding to be forced to clean it up by the government. But even something as innocuous as telling citizens to take some personal responsibility counts as nefarious deflection. I find that argument to be something of a stretch. I mean, thinking has moved on a lot since those days, and there are some elements of producer responsibility that have been centre stage for corporate practice since then. But the idea that an advert suggesting that maybe you shouldn't chuck your rubbish out of the car window, the idea that that in itself equals deflection because drinks companies were thinking in the 1970s that it would be better for them if their customers put their bottles in the bin, not on the highway. You have to be deeply in your us versus them trench to see that as nefarious. Mann goes on to relate that perspective then to the climate change debate. The enemy has masterfully executed a deflection campaign, inspired by those of the gun lobby, the tobacco industry and beverage companies, aimed at shifting responsibility from corporations to individuals. Personal actions, from going vegan to avoiding flying, are increasingly touted as the primary solution to the climate crisis. Though these actions are worth taking, a fixation on voluntary action alone takes the pressure off the push for government policies to hold corporate polluters accountable. I can imagine why a climate scientist will get frustrated with people getting diverted all the time talking about personal responsibility. I have talked about such things here myself, suggesting that nobody should be getting guilt-tripped over flying, nobody should be preaching to people what they're allowed to eat. But environmental campaigners have been doing that for decades. They do it because everyone cares about what's most in front of their noses. Campaign groups who couldn't strategize their way out of a paper bag, they just lurch at whatever is biggest in front of them in their own world. It's a push if you're going to suggest that's all happening because the nefarious agents of inaction are making it so. Now, he does acknowledge that at times, he says, climate activists make it easy for them being the enemy. And that's the problem with his phrasing. In Michael Mann's world, the right way to think is exactly how he thinks. And mostly, if you have any variation, you are unwittingly or otherwise playing into the hands of the enemy. The argument that oil companies provide the resource that we demand to enjoy the benefits of the system we built, that doesn't wash with him. Corporations are the polluters, and we will tackle climate change by defeating them and holding them accountable. The idea that those companies are led by, human beings who have a stake in the future as well, by the way, and they might begin to become allies in solving a mutual problem, that isn't apparently acceptable. Because then those corporations might be able to continue making big profits, which others would argue is what you want. Big profits being made from clean energy, not from fossil fuels. And it's not that Mann is anti-corporate by nature. His big message is there should be support for a carbon tax, because that will work most effectively with a modern capitalist society. He criticises the far-left liberals who have turned against such a tax because it's too friendly to capitalism. But that doesn't mean he's prepared to let off the existing fossil fuel companies. And this is one of the interesting aspects of this. Michael Mann gives credit to the occasional moderate Republican where they want to make progress on climate change, but mostly he is aligned with the left. He was an advisor to Hillary Clinton's election campaign in 2016. He was an active campaigner for Biden in 2020, and mostly when he refers to Republicans, it's to dismiss them en bloc. But he's clearly confused about the gaping division opening up on the left. He talks with some justice about how the Russian bots and the front groups use the tactic of driving a wedge between the groups on the other side, encouraging their divisions and internal arguments. But even though they might seek to exploit such rifts, they didn't create them. The fact is, his own side is drifting away from reality in different areas, and it's a process that he finds difficult to come to terms with. The climate action deflectors, moreover, are also attempting to drive a wedge into pre-existing rifts within the climate activist community. That includes rifts arising from the ongoing debate over the role of personal behaviour versus systemic change. It also includes rifts involving the politics of identity and matters of gender, age and race. when the climate discourse devolves into a shouting match over diet and travel choices and becomes about personal purity, behaviour shaming and virtue signalling, we get a divided community unable to speak with a united voice. We lose, fossil fuel interests win. He's right, of course, that Russia has been an active agent in a lot of these debates, and the online bots that engage with climate change on social media can often be traced there. The Russian state has a modus operandi to fan the flames of dissent within the democracies, something that's remarkably easy to do, and it has done so on the issue of climate change as much as it has anywhere else. And there's a straightforward interest there, easy to understand. Russia is a petro-state. It has vast fossil fuel reserves that will become stranded assets when the world eventually moves to a carbon-free energy future. It has a direct interest in preventing that, or at least delaying it. But the idea that the culture wars is somehow a consequence of the nefarious forces of inaction can only come if you're not paying attention. Mann says this: you might argue that this was a clash between youthful idealism on one side and jaded pragmatism and realpolitik on the other, but there were elements of race and culture and perhaps gender undergirding the confrontation. One former Green Party candidate for the US Senate and Congress, Arne Menconi, posed the rhetorical question: have you noticed the other hit pieces coming from our own side that when you don't agree with them, you're a sexist and racist? Really? You're just noticing that? I must confess that I share the concern and bewilderment of my climate scientist peers. We've chosen to devote our lives to raising awareness about the climate crisis, and yet many ostentable climate advocates would gladly throw us under the bus because we're not living our lives as off-the-grid vegan hermits. If you're a political activist who genuinely believes that your side has the monopoly of believing in science, it must be a moment of extreme cognitive dissonance to notice the nature of the purity tests that are being applied against you by the woke left. Michael Mann doesn't record what he thinks of the idea there might be 56 genders. Probably simply asking the question would mask you out as one of the forces of inaction. But you have to wonder. He notes with some validity how the left purity tests that can focus on the hypocrisy of anyone who fails to be perfect can be gleefully jumped upon by your opponents. Well, they would, wouldn't they? Why would dividers go after scientists? The public perceive scientists to possess both authority and integrity. They rank as the most trusted messengers in society. Undermine the public's trust in scientists and you undermine their message. The problem the deniers face is that the evidence is so overwhelming that attacks on the science itself aren't credible. Exposing scientists as supposed hypocrites, however, is a relatively effective way of undermining their perceived integrity along with their credibility as climate messengers. And that's true, no doubt. But it doesn't exist only because of nefarious forces using it as a weapon. It comes partly as a consequence of scientists stepping over the line to become advocates in major areas of public policy, both here and with the recent issue of the pandemic. People generally feel resentful and resistant to being bossed around and being told how to live their lives. They become actively, keenly interested to discover the hypocrisy of those who are perceived, rightly or wrongly, and sometimes it's wrongly, as doing the bossing when they don't live up to the message that they're giving others. Piers Morgan will go after what he sees as the hypocrisy of climate campaigners. Is he paid to do so by the fossil fuel companies? No. He's just in touch with how his audience feels about the current state of the debate, and he plays to it in big capital letters because that's his style. In other words, it's there partly as a reaction to what people are doing, not just because fossil fuel companies put it there. He recognises how the political divide plays out with this, but only partially because he's got both feet on one side of a divide. Anger can be stirred up among both progressives and conservatives. With progressives, it's typically about issues of perceived injustice. With conservatives, it often involves the perceived loss of personal liberty. Making climate action all about personal sacrifice reinforces the dominant conservative framing. They'll take away your hamburgers and plastic straws, then your guns too. Predictably, this very notion has become a tribal rallying call for conservatives. Well, yeah, but There are significant and important groups of people on the left who would embrace that framing. They want to take away the hamburgers and the plastic straws and the guns, possibly not in that order. Those things have been played up by polemicists on the right for sure. But they're pointing at what's there and exaggerating it a little. They're not making it up. Once you see things in these combative terms, then everything has to fit that framework. Mann unwisely went on to say this: it also appears to have interfered in recent elections in the United Kingdom, working with the climate change denying UK Independence Party, UKIP, for example, to pass Brexit. Brexit is expected to erode the power of the European Union, including its influence on climate policy. Not everything is about climate change. Underestimating and mistaking the forces that led to Brexit has been a classic mistake on a number of those on the Remainer side. There was a strong element of how people feel that internationalists and technocrats are taking over, forcing a worldview on the country that people distrust. Michael Mann's belief that maybe it was because of Russia and fossil fuel companies wanting to resist climate change, I would suggest that's not his strongest argument. Later in the book, he argues against all policy measures except for 100% renewable energy. He acknowledges there are a few good faith people who believe in nuclear, I suppose, although he explains why they're completely misguided. And in these sections you can see he's speaking as a campaigner, not as a scientist. His perspective is that of a very traditional environmentalist, and his level of evidence for his argument follows that tradition, not the scientific one. So, for instance, he dismisses the concern about wind turbines killing birds out of hand. It's fair enough to observe, as he does, that some of the climate skeptics stretch credibility with their newfound concern for bird life and how they focus on the issue. I made the same comment in my recent video on the topic. But he dismisses the argument like this: when it comes to the welfare of our feathered friends, I put more trust in the Audubon Society, whose actual mission is to protect birds and the places they need today and tomorrow. The Audubon Society has stated that climate change is a far greater threat than wind turbines. That's a pretty weak argument from authority. As we saw in the video I did on the subject, the issue is acknowledged with due seriousness by a number of conservationists and wind turbine manufacturers, by the way. They're working on solving the problem, or at least reducing it. They probably wouldn't be if climate change is more important had been the last word on the matter. This is my constant point. Judge arguments on their merits, not just on whose mouth they came out of. Just as it is for critics of Michael Mann, so it should be for Michael Mann as well. In the last chapter, Mann does do something valid and difficult for someone in his position, which is to go after the more extreme people on his own side, the doomists. He criticises those who argue that we're into a sixth mass extinction, those that argue that methane release is taking us to a tipping point, and those 11,000 supposed scientists who produced a letter arguing that because there's a climate emergency, we need to move away from capitalism. Which may or may not be an arguable political position, but if supposed scientists put it forward as being a scientific opinion, then it fuels the suspicion of good faith people in the centre that a declaration of a climate emergency is just a tool to overthrow capitalism. But it's all driven by the nefarious forces, remember. So, for instance, when the Spiked website, which came out of the Revolutionary Communist Party and its magazine Living Marxism in the UK, it's generally antagonistic towards climate scientists. An organ of the left, anti-climate activism, whatever can be the reason. Well, he finds that there was a donation to the site by a foundation run by the Koch brothers. So of course that's the reason. Except it's not, really. I interviewed one of the former revolutionary communists and former editor of Living Marxism, Claire Fox. The fact is that the left, when she was most active in that vein, had a huge antipathy for the environmental movement, and one that she certainly retains to this day. They were for the coal workers. The environmentalists wanted coal to be shut down. So yes, the Koch brothers might have wanted to support an organ that had the same beliefs and values that they had in that area. One doubts that they bought into the revolutionary communism bit, but they've rather left that behind. But Michael Mann is fishing well outside his pond when it comes to politics, and he's getting the cause and effect mixed up. Here's a fact: some people think differently to you, and the vested interest will often seek to fund those whose beliefs match their own, not necessarily paying them and then telling them what to think. And it's this inability to engage with good faith arguments that are opposite to his own that leads Michael Mann astray on this. So, for instance, his contempt for Michael Schellenberger and others leads him to dismiss out of hand arguments about the role of energy in alleviating poverty in the poorest parts of the world. The energy poverty conceit rests on the flawed premise that lack of access to energy, rather than to say food, water, healthcare and so on, poses the primary threats to people in the developing world, and moreover that fossil fuels are the only viable way to provide that energy. Which is kind of missing the point. How do you get access to food, water and healthcare? Generally because your society develops and is able to build the infrastructure that supports those things. You know, capitalism. And how do societies develop? How has that historically always happened? Through finding mechanisms for using more useful energy. Right now, if you're talking road building, steel making, concrete making levels of useful energy, then a few solar panels doesn't get it done. That's a valid argument requiring serious discussion. It's not a trick by the fossil fuel companies. The answer doesn't have to be more fossil fuels, but there has to be an answer. At one point in the book, Michael Mann notes how conservatives were for nuclear power as a form of what he described as hippie punching, rather than because he said they were interested in real solutions. And he added this: consider, for example, the attacks on global warming icon and conservative punching bag Al Gore. My friend Bob Inglis, a former Republican congressman from South Carolina, has said, in my first 6 years in Congress, from 1993 to 1999, I had said that climate change was hooey. I hadn't looked into the science. All I knew was that Al Gore was for it, and therefore I was against it. Well, indeed. Now, you might conclude from that maybe science should be represented by non-partisan figures who are trusted not to have a political agenda that might influence what they say. It's an excellent argument why scientists should, as Mann first said to that session of Congress all those years ago, stay outside of a political fray. Not necessarily not to be public, but Michael Mann hasn't just been public, he's been a partisan campaigner of the left, albeit of the centre left, campaigning for Clinton, campaigning for Biden, campaigning against specifically fossil fuel companies, all in the name of science. But fossil fuel company CEOs are now starting to set net zero targets. A Conservative government is committed to net zero in the UK. It's not been that way recently in the US, but there are various forces on both sides that need to be engaged. The last thing you want to do is to alienate them. It's a point that Mann acknowledges and applies to the mistakes of others, but apparently doesn't apply to his own frame. In the world where science is now increasingly informing public policy, and at a time when both political sides have elements of the agenda where they're prone to drift away from facts and evidence into, shall we say, wishful thinking, this book, Michael Mann's book, is a powerful but unintended testament to the dangers that follow when you get that balance wrong.